Why are humans the most terrifying Deathworlders, you ask? Oro stood before a class of docile warriors, the elite of Zoilia, a Category 1 Deathworld. He scanned the room, noting their disinterested expressions, the kind that suggested they'd rather be anywhere but in his mandatory class. Sure, they have physical strength, endurance, and high adaptability, and that's just scratching the surface. But this class isn't just about listing their strengths. It's to show you why challenging them in the upcoming joint military exercises is a terrible idea. So brace yourselves as we dive deep into what makes them so dangerous for the rest of tonight. Oro inhaled deeply, his green chest swelling as he tried to make himself appear more imposing to command the attention of the tough, docile crowd. He even puffed up the 2 stripes of golden hair that ran from his shoulders to the back of his hands, a display meant to intimidate. But not even when he adjusted the glaring metal mask that covered one of his golden eyes and half of his face, a feature that had always caught the attention of even humans, seemed to faze the docile. Noticing that he'd failed, Oro took a deep breath, trying to maintain his composure as he scanned the room. The docile warriors had a different physiology than him, muscular and tall, with fur that shimmered in varying shades of bronze, gold, and copper. Their bipedal forms were built for battle, with thick tails that served as both a stabilizer and a weapon in combat. Each of them had bald patches that spoke of past victories, and their armor of leather and metal plates was decorated with the trophies of slain beasts. These were the elite of Zoilia, the fiercest fighters the planet had to offer. And yet, as Oro looked closer, he saw nothing but boredom. Corvash, the tallest of the group, with a deep scar running down his face, was leaning back in his chair, lazily spinning a knife between his fingers. Across from him, Zinara, with her bright copper fur and piercing yellow eyes, was tapping her claws against the table in an annoying pattern, her mind clearly elsewhere. Next to her, Gorak, whose armor was adorned with the bones of his latest kill, was dozing off, his head nodding forward every few seconds before jerking back up. Even Thalix, the youngest and most eager of the group, seemed disengaged, staring at the ceiling as if the answer to his boredom lay somewhere in the metal beams above. Virel, a warrior known for his tricks and deceiving in combat, was chatting with the warrior next to him, not even bothering to lower his voice. Oro felt his patience wearing thin. He had faced down entire battalions, wrestled with the most dangerous creatures on his homeworld, a Class 2 Deathworld that made Zoilia look like paradise. He had fought and negotiated with some of the most cunning minds in the galaxy, but nothing had tested his nerves quite like this room full of indifferent warriors. "Are you even listening?" Oro's voice cut through the chatter and the annoying tapping. He slammed his hand down on the table, the impact reverberating through the room. The knife slipped from Corvash's fingers, embedding itself in the table with a loud thunk. Gorak jolted awake, blinking in confusion as he looked around, while Zinara's tapping came to an abrupt halt. Thalix snapped his gaze from the ceiling, and Virel turned slowly to face Oro, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. "Do you think this is a joke?" Oro continued, his voice rising with each word. "Do you think you can afford to be so careless, so foolish, as to underestimate the humans? Let me make one thing crystal clear. If you go into this military exercise with that attitude, you won't just lose, you'll be humiliated, defeated so thoroughly that the stories will be told for generations. You'll be the cautionary tale of how Zoilia's finest fell because they didn't take the threat seriously." The room fell into a heavy silence, the warrior's eyes now fixed on Oro, the weight of his words finally starting to sink in. Oro let the stillness linger, his frustration easing as he measured their reactions. "This is your last chance to start paying attention," he warned, his voice low and controlled. "Because if you walk out of here without understanding what you're up against, you'll have no one to blame but yourselves when the humans tear you apart." Zinara, with a playful glint in her eyes and fur shimmering with a vibrant gold hue, couldn't help but chuckle.
Looks like Oro's finally got our attention, huh? Just hope he doesn't start assigning extra deals or anything. I didn't sign up for that.
Corvash, the imposing leader with a deep scar running down his muzzle, ignored Zinara's remark and gave Oro a thoughtful nod, straightening his back. Despite the interruption, he seemed to acknowledge that perhaps the class warranted more attention than he initially thought. The others followed suit, their expressions softening slightly as they took Corvash's cue. Virel, his eyes gleaming with mischief, leaned back in his chair and smirked. "Come on, Corvash. Oro's just an old alien who thinks too highly of himself. If we really want to handle the humans, we should focus on a few clever tricks. You know, like poisoning their water. Why sit through all this when we can win with little effort?" He winked at the other students, undermining Oro's authority and prompting a few snickers and murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Oro felt the urge to rip off the mask from his face and throw it at Virel, but remembering that slamming the table hadn't worked, he decided to try a different approach. "I had prepared a standard class for the docile, but since that's too boring for you, let me tell you a story. About the time a human crash-landed on my homeworld, Holadur." Oro pushed his voice to convey a tone of terror, his eye almost bulging out of his face as he pressed the metal mask against his skin. This finally captured the class's full attention, even Virel and Zinara staring at him in uneasy anticipation. "It all began on a day like any other. That morning, a trail of smoke streaked across the sky of Holadur, a trail seen only by the people of a distant village who thought nothing of it at the time." Corvash leaned forward slightly, his scarred face showing a rare sign of interest as Oro continued. His eyes were locked onto the speaker, a stark contrast to Virel, who had leaned back in his chair, feet casually propped up on the table. The smirk on Virel's face made it clear he wasn't taking any of this seriously, his body language openly disrespecting Oro's efforts. Oro ignored Virel's insolence, focusing on the few warriors who seemed to be paying attention. "The story begins with a human ship crashing into a desert," Oro said, his voice steady. "The wreckage was a twisted heap of metal scattered across the scorching lands. Out of this inferno crawled a single human, barely alive, yet somehow surviving the crash. His body was battered, his skin burned from the heat of re-entry, but he pulled himself free." Oro began to pace slowly through the room, his eyes scanning the faces of his students. He noticed Zinara was already starting to drift again, her gaze wandering to the window as if she was dreaming of being anywhere but here. Virel, meanwhile, kept his feet on the table, casually gazing at the teacher with his arms crossed, a picture of complete indifference. Oro's frustration simmered beneath the surface, but he pressed on. "The human wasn't able to recover any food from the burning ship," Oro continued. "Alone in the vast desert, with nothing but the clothes on his back, he was facing certain death. No one to help him, no resources to sustain him, just miles of scorching sand in every direction. But instead of giving in, he pushed forward." Oro's voice grew more intense as he described the human's ordeal. "For an entire day and night, the human trudged through the desert, the sun beating down on him during the day, and the cold seeping into his bones at night. Exhausted, dehydrated, and hungry, he didn't stop. His body was on the brink of collapse, yet he kept moving, driven by some primal will to survive." Oro paused, glancing at his audience. Corvash was still attentive, his eyes narrow as he absorbed every detail. But Zinara's gaze had wandered again, and Virel was more interested in annoying him with his gaze than in the tale being spun. Oro felt another pang of irritation, but he swallowed it down and continued. "As dawn approached, the human reached a dangerous forest. With hunger and thirst blocking his fear, he marched deep into the woods, finding hydration through smashed fruits and food from roots, leaves, and small animals. The forest that would be terrifying for most species became a source of sustenance and shelter. Virel uncrossed his arms, leaning forward in his chair. His smirk had faded slightly as he addressed the class, his tone laced with skepticism. "Come on, Oro," he began, his voice dripping with doubt. "Are you seriously expecting us to believe this? A species that can survive on roots, leaves, and meat? That sounds like a load of nonsense. How can one creature eat all of that? It doesn't make sense. You sure you are not making this up as you go?"
A murmur of agreement rippled through the class. Zinara chuckled softly, her tapping claws resuming their rhythmic dance, while Gorak, now fully awake, nodded in agreement. Even Thalix, who had been paying attention earlier, looked uncertain, his gaze flicking between Virel and Oro. Oro, unfazed by the disruption, folded his arms and faced the group. "Humans are neither pure carnivores nor herbivores," he stated, his voice firm. "They are omnivores, capable of consuming a staggering variety of foods. Some humans can eat tree bark if they're desperate, earthworms and insects too. Their diet is as adaptable as they are, and they can survive on almost anything. They just choose not to most of the time." He let his words hang in the air for a moment, noting the mixed reactions from the class. Corvash remained stoic, absorbing every word, while Virel rolled his eyes, clearly unimpressed. But there was a flicker of interest in another one of them. Thalix, the youngest warrior in the group, leaned forward, curiosity evident in his expression.
"What happened to the human in the forest after he ate?"
he asked, his voice breaking the silence that had settled over the room. Oro felt a surge of satisfaction at the question, pleased that he was finally reaching some of them.
"The human found a river,"
Oro continued, his voice taking on a storytelling cadence,
"and he kept surviving in that forest. He constructed a shelter using leaves, sticks, and tree bark, materials that wouldn't even cross most of your minds in a situation like that. But for the human, it was instinct. Survival to them is second nature."
Oro began to walk among the class, his sharp eyes scanning each student as he spoke. Zinara was still half distracted, but Virel was watching him closely, his earlier doubt seemingly replaced with a grudging interest. Gorak listened quietly, the weight of the story starting to settle on him.
"And then one day,"
Oro said, his voice dropping to a near whisper,
"the humans stumbled across one of the most dangerous creatures of Holadur, the Call, a creature that would send shivers down the spine of even my people, who are no strangers to danger."
For a fleeting moment, the entire class was silent, their attention fully on Oro. Even Virel paid some attention, his gaze fixed on the storyteller.
"But unlike my people," Oro continued, "the human didn't know the creature was violently territorial. He didn't feel the same fear, the same instinct to flee. Instead, over the course of many days, he began feeding the creature with some of his food. Slowly they bonded, and before long, the creature began to accompany the human on hunts."
Oro paused, letting the full weight of the story sink in. The class was riveted now, even Zinara, her playful demeanor subdued by the tale. For the first time, Oro felt like he had them exactly where he wanted them. That is, all except Virel, who seemed bothered by something. Virel slowly took his feet off the table, his earlier cocky demeanor giving way to a more serious expression. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees as he voiced his skepticism.
"So, we are supposed to believe that some human just crashed onto a planet and managed to do something your species never did in all your history? Come on, Corvash, Zinara," he said, turning to his peers. "There's no way you are buying into this nonsense."
Corvash, the leader of the group, exchanged a thoughtful look with Zinara. Her usual playful grin had faded into a more contemplative expression, her bright copper fur catching the dim light of the room as she nodded subtly. They both turned toward Oro, their attention fully on him now, waiting for his response. Oro touched his metal mask, the cool surface grounding him as he took a deep breath. His wide chest, covered in green skin that had seen countless battles, inflated as he prepared to answer. "Humans have a long history of domesticating wild animals," he began, his voice steady. "They've tamed wolves into dogs, bred wild horses to be their companions in battle, and even trained birds of prey to hunt for them. What that human did on call wasn't an anomaly. It was in their nature. They've been turning the wild into allies for thousands of years." As Oro spoke, he began to approach Virel, his gaze locking onto the young warrior with an intensity that made Virel shift uncomfortably in his seat. "You think this is all just a story, Virel? Well, imagine this. In the upcoming military exercises, what if a human decides you're cute? They might try to make you their pet, and once they've rubbed your belly, it might be game over for you." The room fell into a tense silence, then erupted into laughter, Oro's words hanging in the air like a challenge. Thalix, unable to contain his curiosity, finally broke the silence. "What happened to the human after he tamed the call?" he urged, his voice filled with eagerness. Oro glanced around the room, noting that while Virel still looked skeptical, the rest of the class was fully engaged. It was a small victory, but one that spurred him on. "The human eventually began to explore the surroundings of his shelter," Oro continued, his voice calm but captivating. "And one day, he stumbled upon the village that had seen the trail of smoke from his ship's crash many days ago." As he spoke, Oro began to pace the room, his gaze briefly drifting upward to the metal beams that crisscrossed the ceiling, their dull sheen reflecting the low light. "The human was spotted by the guards at the village gate," Oro said, his tone growing more intense, "and that led to a tense first contact. The situation was on the brink of violence, each side uncertain, weapons ready to be drawn." Oro took a glance around the room and saw that he had the warriors' full attention, their earlier boredom replaced by a keen interest in the tale. "As the human stood before the village gates, the call, the beast he had tamed, moved to his side. Its presence alone was enough to prevent the guards from attacking. What followed was a tense conversation that led to the summoning of the village's chief, a middle-aged male named Oromore." As he recounted the events, Oro realized he had gone beyond the lesson he had originally planned. He touched his metal mask contemplatively, wondering if he had already conveyed enough about the resilience and unpredictability of humans. Perhaps it was time to stop. But then he caught sight of Thalix's fluffy ears twitching back, his wide eyes fixed on Oro with anticipation. The young warrior's muzzle was almost salivating as he leaned forward, hungry for more of the story. "Master," Thalix spoke respectfully, his voice tinged with eagerness, "please continue." Oro sighed deeply, realizing there was no turning back now. The class was hooked. He surrendered to their silent demands and continued the tale. "When Chief Oromore arrived at the gates," Oro resumed, "he engaged in a tense conversation with the human, who was equipped with a universal translator. After assessing the situation, Oromore allowed the human into the village under the condition that the call would stay outside. The two exchanged names, Oromore and the human, Dylan. But unlike the guards, Oromore wasn't impressed by Dylan's appearance. He saw no great strength in the human and only invited him into the village as a ruse, thinking it would be a good trick to separate him from the call and attack him when he was alone." Virel, leaning back in his chair with a smug smile, couldn't resist interjecting. "Now that's smart," he said with a hint of sarcasm. "Unlike those easily impressionable guards, Oromore seems like he's got some sense." Oro's expression darkened, and he touched his metal mask as if to steady himself. His voice rose with anger. "Oromor is the fool!" The sudden outburst caused the room to tense, and Oro quickly realized he had let his emotions get the better of him. He lowered his tone, his gaze softening as he saw the class's reactions. Wide eyes, startled glances, and even Corvash sitting up a little straighter. "Oromor was setting himself up for failure," Oro continued more calmly, "because Dylan, the human, had strengths beyond anything that fool could imagine." Virel interrupted the story, a smirk playing on his lips. "So now this Dylan guy's alone inside the village, right? Oromor and the guards could just jump him together, and it'd be over. They'd win, easy." Oro turned his gaze toward Virel, saying nothing for a moment. There was something unsettling about how this young, docile warrior reminded him of his own past self. The arrogance, the overconfidence, it was all too familiar. Struggling to keep his voice low, Oro finally spoke. "That was Chief Oromor's intention from the start, but the human was far too friendly. In the brief time it took for Oromor to return home to fetch a blade, Dylan had already made friends with the guards and charmed the street vendors, promising to teach them how to tame a call in exchange for help in communicating with his people." Sensing an opportunity to impart a broader lesson, Oro continued, his voice more steady. "Humans have a charisma that's among the highest of all known species. Unlike many others, they can quickly build bonds, even in hostile environments, making them all the more dangerous." Virel interrupted again, but this time he earned a few angry glances from his peers. "Oromor is an idiot if he fell for that. If he didn't, he could have just pretended to be nice and attacked the human when he was alone." Oro was growing tired of Virel's foolishness, but he saw too much of his past self in the young warrior to be overly harsh. "By your standards, Virel, Oromor was even smarter than you give him credit for. The chief not only pretended to be nice, but he even invited Dylan to spend the night in his home while hiding the blade he'd brought among his clothes." Virel opened his mouth as if to say something, but a glance at Corvash's stern expression, Zinara's narrowed eyes, and even Thalix's intense gaze made him reconsider. He stayed silent, allowing Oro to continue. "Dylan accepted Oromor's invitation and followed him toward his home," Oro said, his voice now more controlled. "The chief waited for the right moment, hoping to catch the human off guard. But as they walked, it became clear that Dylan's awareness was exceptional. Oromor, an experienced fighter, couldn't find a single opening to strike. They reached the door of Oromor's home, and still, the human hadn't let his guard down for even a moment." Virel looked like he was about to speak again, when Zinara leaned over and whispered,
"If you interrupt again, I'll bite you."
Her tone was playful, but there was an edge to it that made Virel think twice before opening his mouth. Oro noticed the exchange, and though the story was reaching a difficult point, the young warrior's growing interest pushed him to continue. "Chief Oromor was planning to risk it all and attack Dylan from the front, but before he could make up his mind, his daughter Haxia opened the door. Oromor was forced to keep up the act, pretending to be nice longer than he intended. Before he realized what was happening, Haxia had already heard Dylan's story of how he survived the crash and invited him to share a meal." Zinara interrupted with a grin.
"I see where this is going."
Her words were light, but Oro ignored her, pushing on with the tale, struggling to keep the sadness from showing on his face. "To keep up appearances, Oromor had no choice but to offer the human a roof for the night," Oro continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Neighbors started gathering to see the human, and before Oromor knew it, his home was full. He had lost his chance to attack Dylan in secret." Oro paused for a moment, reflecting on the story, and Virel took advantage of the silence. "Oromor is a fool if he let things get to that point. There are plenty of ways to discreetly kill someone. Poison his food, for example. Oro didn't even feel anger this time, just a deep disappointment. Virel, you and Oromore must be brothers from different planets and times, because, believe me, Chief Oromore did try to poison the human, many times, but each attempt ended in failure. Give humans capsicum, and they call it a spice. Offer them alcohol, and they'll ask for more. The human, Dylan, not only survived Oromore's attempts, but seemed to enjoy them. Oro paused, lost in thought, as the weight of his memories settled over him. The warriors' reactions were almost uniform, mouths agape, eyes wide in disbelief. Yet among them, Virel alone remained defiant, his gaze challenging and skeptical. Something in that gaze struck a chord deep within Oro, compelling him to continue the tale, though he had never intended to go this far. Oromore's anger was a storm inside him, Oro said, his voice growing darker, laden with the horror of what he was recounting. It was a rage born not just from his failures, but from the realization that he had become a guest in his own home. Oro's footsteps were deliberate as he moved closer to Virel, his towering form casting a shadow over the young warrior. Leaning down, the eye behind the metal mask loomed ominously above Virel. One day, after returning home from an inspection, Oromore found Dylan and Hexia in a corner, kissing.
I knew that's where this story was going,
Zinara began to say, but her voice trailed off as she caught sight of Oro's intense gaze. His expression was too grave, too menacing for her usual playful remarks. Oro continued, his tone growing more sinister, tension tightening in the room like a coiled spring. Virel, now visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat, his fur flattening as if he could shrink away from the towering presence of Oro. Oromore's anger exploded in a violent outburst. He threw punches at the human, and Dylan took them all without flinching, without reaction. When Oromore finally grew too tired to continue, convinced the human must be dead, his fury turned to his own daughter. He grabbed Hexia by the hair, dragging her through the door and into the village, shouting her shameful act for all to hear. Oro leaned even closer to Virel, his voice low but tinged with a hint of madness. Oromore dragged Hexia through the streets until he found a pile of dry wood, wood that was meant for an execution in a few days' time. Blinded by hate, he tied his daughter to a pole above the wood and lit a flame, declaring her treason of their species to the entire village. The room fell silent, the air thick with a sense of dread. Oro's voice lowered, transforming into something reminiscent of an old man telling a ghost story to frighten children. But things didn't go as Oromore had planned. As he leveled his accusations against his daughter, and her screams filled the air, the human, Dylan, came running, his face bloodied. Without hesitation, he stepped into the burning wood and saved Hexia from the flames, as if he couldn't feel the pain of his feet burning, as if the fire couldn't touch him. The warriors stared at Oro, their faces painted with horror. Corvash, usually composed and stoic, now had lost all semblance of control, his expression twisted with shock. Zinara, no sign of her quick wit and humor, was frozen in place, her mouth slightly agape. The youngest of them, Thalix, had his hand clamped over his head as if trying to block out the images Oro's story conjured. Even Virel, always skeptic provocateur, looked shaken, his body stiff as though the tale had struck something deep within him. But Oro wasn't finished. With movement so slow and deliberate that it sent chills down their spines, he reached for his iron mask. The sound of metal scraping against his skin echoed continuously in the silent room. As Oro removed his mask, the warriors braced themselves for what lay beneath. What they saw was more horrifying than they could have imagined, a face that was a nightmare incarnate. His skin was charred and melted in places, twisted into grotesque shapes that barely resembled a face at all. Scars crisscrossed his features, and the previously blocked eye seemed to bulge out unnaturally, surrounded by raw flesh. "This, Virel," Oro said, his voice now a guttural rasp, "is what happened when the human finished rescuing Haxia and came for him." Oro's bulging eye seemed to bore into Virel's very soul. "He destabilized Oromor with a single punch, then dragged him across the ground like a bag of dirt, forcing his face into the flames as he screamed." The terror in Oro's voice, combined with the sight of his disfigured face, sent shockwaves through the room. Virel, who had been sitting closest, was hit hardest. His eyes widened in pure horror, and he recoiled so forcefully that his chair tipped backward. He crashed to the ground, a mess of fur and limbs, scrambling to get back up, as if the very sight of Oro's face had burned him. For a moment Oro stood there, his disfigured face revealed to the class. The stunned silence that followed was suffocating, and it was only then that Oro realized what he had done. He had let too much slip, far too much. The lesson had spiraled out of control, becoming something far more personal than he had ever intended. The looks of terror on the warriors' faces told him he had gone too far, crossing a line that should have remained untouched. Oro took a step back from Virel, moving slowly to a lone corner of the room, as if trying to distance himself from the raw emotions he had just unleashed. He tried to steady his voice, to bring the story back to its intended lesson. "Oromor was not praised for what he did to his daughter when he woke up several days later," Oro said, his voice now subdued, almost hollow. "Instead of understanding, he found that the village had turned against him. They stripped him of his title, and in the ultimate punishment for our kind, they severed his name in half. Oromor was no more." Oro stared at the ground as he spoke, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "And so, I, Oro, received a final piece of news before leaving the planet for a life in space. The human had been rescued by his people a few days later. He was allowed to take Haxia and his pet Call with him." He could barely bring himself to look at his students, ashamed of how far he had let the story go. But he knew he had to finish the lesson, if only to bring some sense of closure to the horror he had just shared. "With this, class, we finish our lesson," Oro said, his voice firm despite the tremor of regret beneath it. "I hope now you understand why it is such a bad idea to challenge the humans in the upcoming military exercise. They are the kind of Deathworlders who crash onto a hostile planet with nothing, and leave with a new pet and a girlfriend, whom they rescued from her terrible father. A father who will never see her again, except for some untrustworthy news that they may or may not have gotten married on a wild planet somewhere in the galaxy." The room remained silent, the weight of the story pressing down on everyone. Oro turned his gaze to the floor as he stood close to the door, waiting for them to leave the room, the lesson taught and the pain of his past laid bare. Oro stood at the front of the class, expecting nothing but silence as the warriors filed out, the weight of his lesson hanging heavy in the air. But as they began to leave, something unexpected happened. Virel, the first to pass by, stopped for a moment. His usual smugness was gone, replaced by a rare seriousness. "I won't challenge the humans. You win," he muttered, his voice low but resolute. Oro didn't respond, simply nodding in acknowledgement as Virel left the room. Zinara was next. She paused beside Oro, her usual playful demeanor softened.
"Hey, cheer up," she said gently. "I bet they're happy now. Haxia might even forgive you if you find her. If I were her, I would."
Her words, though meant to comfort, only deepened the ache in Aro's chest. He managed a small, appreciative nod as she gave him a faint smile before heading out. The young Thalix approached, with his ears still pinned back, the story clearly having affected him.
"Good story, Master Oro," he said simply,
his voice full of admiration. Thalix gave a respectful nod and left, his steps light but thoughtful. Oro listened as a few more docile left the room in silence, their steps echoing through the now empty space. He thought it was over, until he felt a strong embrace around his shoulders, a warmth he hadn't expected. He looked up to see Corvash, the tallest and most imposing of the group, holding him in a firm embrace, his large hand patting Oro's shoulder in a rare display of affection. Corvash's voice, deep and measured, filled the room.
"If I get the chance, I will ask the humans about Haxia. I will do it even if I have to challenge them for that."
The words were heavy with purpose, a vow spoken with the sincerity that only Corvash could deliver. Oro looked up at him, but before he could respond, Corvash turned and left, his footsteps echoing through the corridor. Left alone, Oro stood in the empty classroom, the silence now overwhelming. The emotions of the day, the memories dredged up, and the unexpected warm responses from his students all converged within him. A few droplets fell to the floor, unnoticed by anyone but him. He wiped at his face, returning the iron mask where it belonged. With a heavy heart, Oro finally turned and left the classroom, leaving behind the echoes of a lesson that would not be soon forgotten.